Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to have you here with us today on this webinar on community participation on the conservation of migratory species. This online event is organized by the Convention on Migratory Species, the CMS. My name is Michaela Boudurova-McGurk, and I'm the Senior Program Manager for Fauna and Flora's work in Central Asia region. Today, I'll be helping to moderate this event. Before giving you a breakthrough of today's event and introducing you to our key speakers, I would just like to inform you that today's event is being recorded and the recording will be available afterwards on the CMS YouTube channel. Today, we have a really exciting lineup of speakers with us today to help us launch two new breakthrough CMS studies, focused on integrating community knowledge, rights, and participation into successful conservation strategies for migratory species. We will first start off with some opening remarks from the CMS, which will be followed by a presentation to introduce first of our studies on community participation and livelihoods, which will give us an overview of 10 new guiding principles on community participation. After this, we will delve a little bit deeper and explore the potential for community-based wildlife management in Central Asia, and afterwards hear a community voice perspective from a local organization in Kyrgyzstan. After our last speaker, we will open the floor for some questions and answers. You will see, hopefully, there's a function in Zoom for Q&A where you can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar. Afterwards, at the end, we will then field these to different speakers. At the end, we will be also taking some live questions. And if you would like to do this, you can again use the Zoom function to raise your hand and pose your questions. When you do this, please include your name and affiliation when asking any questions. Before we start, on behalf of the CMS, I would just like to thank the Joint Nature Conservation Committee of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, as well as the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation, for their amazing support provided for these two studies. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our first speaker, Amy Frankel, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Migratory Species, with some opening remarks. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our friends, colleagues, and partners joining us around the world. Today, we are turning our attention to community-based conservation, a topic that is extremely important to both migratory species conservation as well as for sustainable development. Migratory species connect ecosystems, cultures, and nations. They include some of the most iconic wild animals on the planet. They are essential for healthy ecosystems, but they also sustain livelihoods, and many hold deep cultural and spiritual significance for communities around the world. Now, because of their nature, moving across national borders to important habitats, which are sometimes found thousands of miles apart, their survival depends on collaboration across borders, communities, and ecosystems. This fundamental need for cooperation is exactly why CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species, exists. But turning to the topic at hand, why is it so important to involve communities in wildlife conservation? First, Indigenous peoples and local communities are custodians of over a third of the world's most important places for biodiversity and of traditional knowledge and customary practices. They can therefore play a vital role in the conservation of migratory species and their habitats. In 2019, IPBES had a global assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and it highlighted community-based management as an important approach for biodiversity conservation. They also later did an additional report focusing very much on the topic at hand. In addition, last year, we at CMS launched the first ever CMS State of the World's Migratory Species Report. Now, our report also highlighted that the conservation of migratory species requires effective participation of local communities. At the same time, our report found that the populations of many migratory species are declining around the world. They face multiple threats across the many places where they are found. These need to be addressed in a coordinated way so that range states and stakeholders across their entire migratory networks are taking the needed steps to reduce such threats. Now, some species are so endangered that they cannot be legally taken under the treaty. These are those that are listed under CMS Appendix 1. Other species that are listed under CMS Appendix 2 are those that need international cooperation to ensure their improved conservation status. The engagement of local communities is extremely important for migratory species listed on both appendices. But in the case of some Appendix 2 species, which can be taken, community-based efforts can play a critical role for management and sustainable use. Now, governments last year gathered at our 14th meeting of the Conference of the Parties in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, and they adopted 10 principles for community-based conservation. Those principles are further elaborated in one of the documents we are releasing today on community participation and livelihoods. I'm also very pleased that we are releasing the study, Potential for Community-Based Wildlife Management in Central Asia. This new report provides real-world insights into how community-led initiatives on 4 specific species that are under CMS can successfully achieve biodiversity conservation and sustainable livelihoods. For example, the study demonstrates how CMS conservation measures have contributed to the remarkable recovery of saiga antelope and bucara deer populations, even in areas where human activities have expanded, sometimes intensifying human-wildlife conflicts. The work of CMS plays a key role in the achievement of targets 5 and 9 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which are aimed at ensuring that all taking and uses of wild species is legal, sustainable, and safe, and at the benefits that sustainable use of wild species provide to people, in particular IPLCs. In closing, I want to extend my sincere thanks to our key partners who made these studies a reality. The German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation, or BFN, the UK's Joint Nature Conservation Committee, the JNCC, the Frankfurt Zoological Society, the Association for the Conservation of Biodiversity of Kazakhstan, the German Nature and Biodiversity Conservation Union, and of course, and finally, the many CMS colleagues who oversaw and contributed to this very important work. I look forward to the discussions and just want to say thank you to all.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amy, for these opening remarks and helping us dive into this important discussion. Next, and to help us launch our first study on community participation and livelihoods, and to present the 10 new guiding principles, I would like to give floor to Dilys Rowe, the chair of the IUCN Species Survival Commission Specialist Group on Sustainable Use and Livelihoods. Over to you, Dilys.
Great, many thanks, Michaela, and nice to be here with you all. Yes, so I'm going to talk a bit about this first report that's being launched today, which is on the guiding principles for involving local communities in the conservation of migratory species. So if we can have the next slide, please. So just to say right from the outset that this report was prepared by JNCC in the UK, and it's intended to respond to a CMS decision taken at the previous COP13 on community participation and livelihoods. And the report, which I really thoroughly recommend everybody to read, contains case studies of community management of migratory species, as well as the 10 guiding principles to further support the involvement of communities going forward. There are some great case studies and inspiring information in the report. And I think it's important to flag from the outset that the principles that are derived and the general discussion in the report builds on decades of scholarship on community-based conservation. I mean, this is a subject which has been studied in practice, in policy and academia for probably getting on 50 years now. So there's a really strong foundations on which to build. But it pays specific consideration to the unique circumstances that surround migratory species. So next slide, please. So one of the early sort of fundamental pieces of work that's helped us understand the conditions that best support community involvement in conserving and protecting species is the work of Nobel Prize winning economist Elinor Ostrom, which dates back to the 1990s. And really her work, she defines 8 guiding principles, but they essentially revolve around the ability of local communities to set rules, to exercise their responsibilities, and to have their rights respected. And the IPBES Global Assessment in 2019 that Amy referred to also highlights that Indigenous peoples and local communities are the most effective stewards of biodiversity, but biodiversity is still declining on their land, often because these rights are not respected. So even though we know what we need to do in order to support community participation, we still seem to need to keep reminding ourselves that we need to do it. Implementation in practice has been really challenging. We see significant resistance to devolving rights to local communities in some cases, and also rights not being recognised. And we also see challenges with external pressures such as illegal wildlife trade and so on. So consequently, the Global Biodiversity Framework agreed in Montreal continues to highlight the need for Indigenous peoples and local communities' knowledge, their capacities and their rights to be front and centre in taking action for biodiversity. Next slide, please. Migratory species are particularly challenging when we're thinking about community-based conservation because it's really difficult to think about who owns the land, who has rights to use resources when we're thinking about species which cross entire continents, if not more than one continent. So this lack of clarity about rights and ownership, rather than incentivising common property resource management, where everybody has an incentive to conserve resources, actually results in what's known as a tragedy of the commons, where people treat these resources as open access resources, and the idea is you get in there first and exploit that resource before anybody else does, and you see species populations being decimated as a result of this. And because migratory species ranges extend over such vast areas, this can be really challenging, and it really requires international coordination because these ranges extend way beyond the ranges at which communities live and interact and can operate and coordinate together. Next slide, please. The other further challenges are the fact that it's really difficult actually to work out what is sustainable when we're talking about offtake of some of these species, who decides what's sustainable, who's allowed to offtake and who isn't, how are costs and benefits shared, particularly across the entire range of a species. And in some cases you find that communities might benefit in one area, in one part of the range, and they may not benefit in other parts of the range. And there's not equity across the range in terms of how costs and benefits are shared. So this can reduce the incentives to conserve species and result in a vicious spiral of decline. Next slide, please. So the guiding principles, which are intended to help resolve some of these challenges and to promote sort of international agreement on how best to involve communities. Next slide, please. There's 5 sort of categories of principles, and the first one is around rights, and specifically land and resource use rights. I'm not going to go into each of the principles in detail. They're all set out there very clearly in the document, but just to skim over them quickly, the first one, again, is just sort of restating this importance about the need for secure and equitable land and resource use rights for communities, so that they have security of tenure over their land, and they know what they can and cannot use, and what their rights say and what their responsibilities are. And related to that, one thing that's really important is that communities really need support to recognise those rights so that they can then exclude others from accessing those resources and over-exploiting them. So particularly in the case where you've got powerful external actors trying to come in and exploit resources, trampling roughshod over the rights of resident communities, we really need external support to help them uphold those rights. Next slide, please. The next category is around management responsibilities. So this is around the need to, so 3 different principles here. The first one is about the need to support local leadership, to support local management, and to support local decision making, because this gives a sense of ownership and provides those incentives that are needed to invest in conservation and coexistence. The second principle is around the need for co-management and collaboration, and particularly in the context of integrating traditional knowledge and practices along with scientific knowledge and practices into conservation practice and management. That significantly enhances the success of that, increasing its effectiveness and also its acceptability. And thirdly, in this, there's the need for setting community management in the context of an international approach, international coordination and internationally regulated management. And this is particularly important in terms of thinking about the need to control for illegal wildlife use. Next slide, please. The third category is about the importance of spiritual values and attitudes, and the need to really understand the spiritual values, the traditional beliefs that local people hold, and to integrate that into conservation practice. The next category is about cooperation among communities along migratory pathways. And this is really, again, as I said before, acknowledging the extent of the range of some migratory species and the need to bring communities together in order to coordinate and share knowledge and share experiences, and recognizing that this sharing of knowledge and experiences can be facilitated through international processes and particularly through transboundary initiatives. Next slide, please. And the final category and final 3 principles are kind of cross-cutting intersectional issues. So the first one is recognizing that across the range of a migratory species, there might be some places which are particularly important for intense conservation efforts. So whether these are particularly important breeding sites or feeding grounds, these can have a disproportionate impact, and those are where we might really want to invest particular effort in engaging communities. The next one is recognizing that there are different costs and benefits associated with conservation, and that it's really important to acknowledge that and make sure we avoid inequitable outcomes along the migratory, along the range of the migratory species in order to increase the long-term sustainability of conservation. And finally, just going back to this sort of really important issue of illegal wildlife trade, recognizing that this is such a powerful external threat to conservation. It can totally undermine community institutions and community-based management. So we need to couple the need to strengthen ownership and rights with to also really bring in strong law enforcement and strong disincentives to prevent poaching, either by community members or by enabling them to facilitate access by other groups that are interested in illegal wildlife trade. So it's really important to get that balance right between incentives for good stewardship and then also increasing the disincentives to engage in illegal wildlife trade. So those are the 10 principles. Apologies for whizzing through them so quickly. Do read them in detail and all the background information that's in the report that gives you the insights as to why these principles have been highlighted as being critically important. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dilys. That's great. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think you highlighted really clearly some of the unique challenges that come into play with conservation of migratory species, and especially ensuring community participation across the entire range of migratory species. And I think that 10 principles really provide us a clear framework of how this can be implemented for successful conservation and also sustainable livelihoods. To help us delve a little bit deeper into this and explore some real-world examples of how these principles can be put into action, I'd like to now introduce our next speaker, Stefan Sutter, and he will be helping us launch the second study that we are launching today, specifically on the potential for community-based wildlife management in Central Asia. Over to you, Stefan, now.
Thank you, Michaela. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today with you and glad that we can present a brief overview, at least, about our work on community-based wildlife management in Central Asia. Next slide, please. First, some background information about wildlife use in Central Asia, the history of it. There's a long history of people and wildlife coexisting close to each other, which also included wildlife use. So people, as you can see on the right side in the pictures, used to hunt wildlife traditionally. But many wild animal species also have a spiritual value for people in Central Asia, still until today. And the traditional wildlife use was always more or less sustainable before hunting for commercial purposes to get horns, hides from wild animals intensified in the 19th century. Next slide, please. This changed a little bit during the Soviet Union. The regime then introduced a strict protection of some endangered species, the number of which has already been depleted through hunting. Protected areas were designated as a wildlife conservation approach. And later on also red books, which were used and still are used to list endangered species comparable to the IUCN Red List. The hunting system was strictly state controlled, and partly hunting took place on industrial scale, as you can see on the pictures on the right side. And wildlife was state owned, and people were not really involved in wildlife management and didn't have any opportunity to influence it, but could obtain hunting permits for wildlife. Next slide, please. Based on the Soviet system, there were a lot of changes afterwards. The management of wildlife today is still in some aspects comparable to the Soviet time. Wildlife is still state-owned, and the state is responsible for it. The wildlife management is organized in an area-based system where hunting areas are designated, and legal entities can obtain the right to manage the wildlife in these areas. And if hunting is planned, they need to purchase licenses to do this. But they have an obligation to protect wildlife from poaching, and legal entities managing wildlife can be commercial organizations, but also NGOs. Non-extractive use is, so without hunting, is not linked to any areas and widely unregulated. And land use rights are usually independent from wildlife use rights or wildlife management rights. So in hunting areas, the wildlife managing organization does not have any influence on the land use. Next slide, please. Especially legal changes in some countries in the last decade helped to open up opportunities for community involvement in wildlife management. Non-extractive use, as it's not limited, basically, apart from some wildlife welfare issues, is possible already today with involvement of communities, but often infrastructure and resources are lacking. And local people can already now found an NGO and thereby get the right to manage wildlife in a hunting area. may it be non-extractive or extractive use. And first successful examples for this exist in Central Asia, which you will hear about more in depth in the next presentation. So the goal of our work was in this study on community-based wildlife management in Central Asia to assess the potential for extending the use of community-based wildlife management for selected mammal species in Central Asia. And the content of the study is to review the history of wildlife management in Central Asia, introduce 4 focal species, which we use to discuss the different aspects of community-based wildlife management, to provide an overview of the approach in international policies and global examples for its use, where it has been successfully used. We then furthermore analyze how wildlife management is organized today and what opportunities exist for community-based wildlife management. And then the main part is to assess how community-based wildlife management can be used for the focus species of the study, and we end with recommendations to governments, international conventions, IUCN, conservation organizations, and others. Next slide, please. The 4 focal species which we selected using criteria like distribution range, so relevant for the region, level of threats of these species, existing conflicts, but also existing good examples, already existing good examples of community-based management of these species. We used Argali sheep, Saiga antelope, snow leopard, and Bukhara deer. Next slide. The conclusions which we make in this study, some of the conclusions are that the existing examples of community-based wildlife management in Central Asia have shown already positive effects on both people, so the communities living next to the wild animals and the wildlife itself. That all focal species would benefit from a larger involvement of local people in the management, which would lead to the creation of ownership attitudes and an understanding of conservation needs for the wildlife species. The use without hunting, so like tourism, for instance, seems possible for all 4 species, but requires thorough planning and investments, and that could be supported by state funding programs, for instance. Strictly controlled and limited extractive use, like hunting, is feasible for Saiga, Argali, and Bukhara deer, whereas snow leopards could benefit from community-based wildlife management, including hunting of prey ungulate species. And in general, community-based wildlife management can help to mitigate existing human-wildlife conflicts, which are already now there in Central Asia. Next slide. Some of the key recommendations we have made in the study, there's a long list, so please look it up later. So to get the full information, some key recommendations are that the community-based wildlife management should be considered as complementary approach to existing wildlife management in Central Asia, which could be beneficial for people and nature and improve conditions for wildlife. It should be the conditions for the use of community-based wildlife management should be improved in the region. There are very good global examples of successful use of community-based wildlife management, and it's important to use lessons learned and identify elements which can be applied in the Central Asian context. Next slide, please. The existing legislation on wildlife should be reviewed and adapted to allow for more community involvement, which has in some countries already happened to some extent, but in others it has not happened yet, and that would help to strengthen the position of communities in wildlife management. As mentioned before, the expansion of non-extractive use, the wildlife tourism, should be supported by technical and financial help, for instance, by the state or development organizations. And extractive use, meaning hunting, should be considered as a potential way to improve wildlife conservation in the region, as long as efficient control mechanisms for this use are in place and hunting quotas are limited. I think that was my last slide. So thank you. And for more details, you can please look at the CMS website later once the study is launched today. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Stefan, for your presentation and for introducing this second study that we're launching today. It's really interesting to hear about the specific context in Central Asia for community-based wildlife management, and really interesting to see the different case studies that I know are included in the study and how many have already shown real positive results for conservation of these full focal and migratory species. And really, again, timely to see the recommendations as well coming out of this study to see how community participation can be enhanced and encouraged even further in this region. So thank you for that. Before I introduce our next speaker, I just wanted to encourage everyone, if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to use the Q&A function to add your questions, and we'll field them just after our final presentation. And our next speaker, I'd like to give floor to Kenji Sultanbayeva. She is the communication manager for the Ilbirs Foundation, a local NGO in Kyrgyzstan who is dedicated to biodiversity conservation, and she will share her perspective on community engagement in this area. Over to you, Kenji.
Thank you. Good evening, morning, or afternoon, everyone, depending which part of the world you are joining. It's my pleasure to be part of this webinar today. And today I'll be speaking about community-based wildlife management in Kyrgyzstan, an evolving and impactful approach that is gaining momentum in the country. This initiative integrates local communities into wildlife conservation efforts, ensuring that wildlife management is not only sustainable, but also let those who live closest to the land and its wildlife. Community-based wildlife management empowers local communities to participate in the sustainable management and the conservation of their natural resources. By combining traditional knowledge with modern conservation practices, this approach creates long-term solutions that benefit both wildlife and local populations. The success of community-based wildlife management in Kyrgyzstan has been made possible through the support of the Ministry of Natural Resources, Ecology and Technical Supervision, the Academy of Sciences, international donors, experts, and local communities. The journey began in 2011 with the support of the GIZ regional program and the state agency, now known as the Ministry of Natural Resources. This program assessed the potential for community-driven wildlife management and facilitated the establishment of 2 local NGOs in the Chui and Isykyl regions. These organizations were founded by the local hunters and the conservationists who understood the importance of protected wildlife and were committed to environmental stewardship. The initiative was supported by the legal framework developed in 2010, which laid the foundation for local NGOs and granted communities their rights to manage their wildlife areas. In 2014, the Snow Leopard Conservation Program, launched by the international NGO Panthera, mobilized local hunters in the Alay and Chongalay regions. Inspired by Tajikistan's successful CBWM model, similar local organizations were established in Kyrgyzstan. This cross-border collaboration strengthened conservation efforts by uniting communities with shared cultural backgrounds and a common interest in wildlife protection. Next slide, please. Over the past decade, community-based wildlife management in Kyrgyzstan has evolved significantly. The first local NGOs, established in 2011 and 2014, laid the groundwork for a national-level organization, the Elbrus Foundation. Elbrus has played a crucial role in strengthening these NGOs by supporting their institutional development and expanding the community-based wildlife management model. As awareness grew, informal groups of hunters and community members began organizing themselves, some of which later formalized into new NGOs. By 2025, 10 community-based nonprofit organizations dedicated to wildlife management had been established. A key strength of these NGOs is that they were founded by former hunters and poachers who transitioned into conservation. Their deep knowledge of wildlife and poaching tactics has made them highly effective in anti-poaching efforts. These organizations are composed solely of local people who feel a strong sense of responsibility for protecting their land for future generations. This patriotic commitment has made them particularly dedicated and resilient. Most recently, under the UNEP Vanishing Treasures program, a new community-based NGO, Jashuliran, was established in Toktogul district of Jalalabad region. Elbrus continues to actively support these NGOs through grants, capacity building initiatives, equipment provision, and field training for wildlife monitoring and anti-poaching efforts and community awareness campaigns. Strong collaboration remains essential to ensuring the long-term sustainability of these conservation efforts. Next slide. The impact of these efforts, not that one. Yes, this. The impact of these efforts has been significant. Several community-led NGOs, including Janaydar, Biktosot, and Karakujur, have achieved notable success in protecting species such as argali and the Asiatic ibex. For example, in Janaydar, argali were once considered locally extinct. However, after several years of monitoring and protection, community rangers detected tracks in 2014, and by 2021, a herd of 34 argali was observed on the northern slopes of Zalai Range, and by 2025, the number exceeded up to 150. In Biktosot, the population of Asiatic ibex increased from just 33 individuals in 2015 to 378 by 2021, and by 2024, the number exceeded 600. These organizations also expanded their protected areas under their management in 2020. In Karakujur, Asiatic ibex were spotted within a year of the establishment of a local NGO, despite heavy livestock grazing in the area. After 3 years of camera trap monitoring, a snow leopard was captured there, a major success for local conservation efforts. If we talk about Shumkartur and about their wildlife-based tourism, next slide, please. About Shumkartur, next one. Next slide. One particularly successful example of community-based wildlife management is Shumkartur and the NGO. This is an NGO in Chongqing. Initially, the organization considered implementing wildlife conservation alongside sustainable hunting. However, they discovered that wildlife-based tourism was a more profitable and sustainable alternative. Today, the area attracts hundreds of domestic and international tourists, eliminating the need for hunting altogether. This case highlights the potential of non-extractive approaches to wildlife management. Other NGOs, such as Akbulung, Eko, Baibosun, and Alatobugu, operate in protected areas where hunting is prohibited instead of focusing on nature tourism to drive local conservation efforts. However, the economic viability of this model depends on the region's tourism potential. In some areas, revenues from ecotourism remain significantly lower than those from hunting tourism, limiting financial sustainability. Challenges and support for sustainability. Next slide. One of the biggest challenges facing community-based NGOs in Kyrgyzstan is the lack of consistent financial support. Many of these organizations rely on volunteers and struggle with high staff turnover, making long-term planning difficult. To address this, the Elbrus Foundation has introduced financial mechanisms that generate income for conservation efforts. Initiatives such as ecotourism, beekeeping, and fruit plantations provide alternative revenue streams with 10 up to 30% of the income allocated to local conservation funds. This model not only supports the wildlife conservation, but also creates economic opportunities for local people. By involving local communities in conservation efforts and equipping them with the necessary financial and technical resources, these NGOs can sustain their work and ensure that wildlife conservation remains a priority. In summary, community-based wildlife management in Kyrgyzstan has made significant strides in engaging local communities in wildlife conservation. Through a combination of legal frameworks, local NGOs, international support, and collaboration with the state agencies and scientific institutions, Kyrgyzstan has developed a successful model for community-driven wildlife management. While financial sustainability remains a challenge, the dedication of local NGOs prove that when communities are empowered to take responsibility for their natural resources, positive change is not only possible, but achievable. The success of community-based wildlife management in Kyrgyzstan is a result of collaborative efforts between local NGOs, communities, international donors, experts, and state agencies, particularly the Ministry of Natural Resources, Ecology, and the Technical Supervision, and the Academy of Sciences. So thank you for your attention.
Amazing. Thank you, Kenji. And thank you for sharing so many different examples of how Ilbris Foundation is already working with so many local organizations to support and encourage community-based management of wildlife and natural resources. It's really positive to see and hear so many stories and examples from Kyrgyzstan. Thank you for that. And with this, we end our presentation part of our webinar, and we'll now move to questions. So please do use the Q&A function if you'd like to post your questions there, or you'll be very welcome to raise your hand again using the Zoom feature, and you can ask your question live. Yes, Muhammad, please go ahead and introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Thank you very much. This is Samar Khan from Pakistan. We also have strong community-based conservation activities within Pakistan. My question is regarding non-consumptive use of wildlife areas regarding tourism. My question is regarding tourism in wildlife areas. How negative consequences, negative impacts of tourism are being managed in such areas, because as we see, where there is tourism, there are a lot of associated problems which are directly impacting wildlife species. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. And I'm opening the floor to our speakers. Would anyone like to take this initially? Perhaps Kenji, I don't know if you have an example from your work in Kyrgyzstan, especially in terms of kind of monitoring, managing, regulating that tourism impact.
Yes, mic was off. So yeah, actually the tourism is just being introduced, and in our experiences, this tourism is based on the nature-based tourism, and this is very special topic for the tourists, and by this time we don't have so many tourists, but we just foresee that kind of negative impacts of the tourism, and also not to disturb the wildlife there. We took also some measures, like how often we should take the trips to the field to observe the wildlife, and what time, and how many people we can take one time, and what kind of transportation we can use, just mostly horse riding or or just walking, yeah. And these kind of things we have already discussed, but by this time we don't have that kind of many tourists. This just being introduced in these wildlife community-based conservancy areas. Yeah, we should always take into account that kind of negative impacts, but the community itself, when we conducted different kind of surveys, their thoughts were positive about the tourists. They were very welcomed, and this is why they, as the local said, that we never had such kind of tourists who like made the mess in the nature, or even the trashes they took by themselves. And really, by this time, we are having very well-educated tourists, and this is really great. And we are always following the requirements, what we should take with us, and we don't have even rubbish bins in the nature because we don't leave it there. We just take everything with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenji, for responding and sharing your perspective. Amy, would you like to speak to this as well?
Yes, thank you very much. And I really think it's an important question. So CMS has also been doing some work on this topic of sustainable tourism. And I think it's very important to understand that tourism itself, and including wildlife-based tourism, is not necessarily sustainable. We have to look at the practices that are put in place, the safeguards. In the marine environment, for example, we've put out guidelines on swimming with animals, and the kind of stressors that can happen if there's too much in terms of the techniques for looking at wildlife in the ocean. So the good news is there are lots of very good guidance for the kinds of measures that should be in place to ensure that the tourism that is there that can generate revenues is also not harming the animals, which are the attraction, let's say, as well as where the funds go. Are they is very important. Where are the revenues coming out of the use of those areas? Is it going to local communities? What are the incentive structures in place and enforcement of any regulations and laws that are in place? So it's a very important question, and appreciate the answer also that you heard. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Amy. Thank you for pointing to that guidelines as well. I will now take a question from the chat before moving to the next live question. So we've got a question from Bilal in Pakistan. And he's asking, how often have you seen the emergence of economic incentives in the communities overcoming those cultural incentives in terms of shifting from cultural to monetary value of species? I'm not sure, Dilis, if you'd like to speak to this potentially.
Yes, great. It's a great question. I don't think it's an either or question in terms of either cultural values or monetary values. I think what's really important in any context where we're trying to engage communities is to recognize how they do value wildlife, and do they value it because it generates or could generate monetary values for them, or do they value it because it has cultural significance for them, or both? And then it's really sort of building on those values in order to really make the most of, if it's an externally imposed conservation initiative, to make sure that it's as acceptable as possible. But just sort of recognizing not everybody is driven by money, but equally money is very important to very many communities. So we don't want to make the naive belief that it doesn't matter. So yeah, I think it's a combination of understanding the context, recognizing the context is always going to be different, and building on what values are the most important for the particular communities that you're trying to work with and engage with.
Thank you, Dilis. And I think it speaks a little bit to the next question that was in the chat in terms of how or do initiatives try and find out the beliefs of local people to see how these can be embedded in stronger protection for species, especially such as snow leopard. And I don't know if Stefan or Kenji would like to speak to this in terms of how do we find out the beliefs of local people so these can be built into any conservation measures as well.
Yeah, I can say a few words about it, but maybe Kenji can add. I think in the examples in Central Asia, which exist already, where communities are involved in wildlife management, these beliefs still are very important. And also, yeah, the cultural value of these species and is very, very relevant. This helps to make the protection of the species stronger, and is a very, very relevant element, I think, for the introduction of community-based wildlife management, especially in Central Asia, where this traditional belief and these traditional values wildlife has for people are still very present and relevant.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, so to add to the point, I think when the community takes the responsibility for the wildlife management, it is really being effective because they know the area and they know that this land will be given to the next generation. And then always, mostly it is based on their patriotic feelings that they have to keep their nature and always, like there is saying in our country that everything is for future generation, and like they take care for their kids and so on and so forth. And in that belief that they think that if they destroy everything, nothing will be left for them. And this is the main main thing that pushes them to conserve the wildlife well. And also the second thing is poaching is being one of the main issues in the areas. Like if the community works like not corrupted, and these NGOs members, like the whole village knows them, yet they have like relatives, neighbors, or neighbors' neighbors, something like that. Lots of known people around, and it's really hard for them to organize their work. But if they are honest and they take the necessarily things, measures on the cases when they catch poachers, it will be really, the work will, it will work well. And for example, Shumpartur is being one of the heroes there on YouTube and or on the social media that they can post about these poachers, like without naming, but they can inform about that to the people, and by knowing, and also they know how they can inform other people. It is just really what kind of consequences the poaching can bring to them, and it can also stop them. And also one of the techniques they are using is working closely with the herders. Herders always give them information that someone is carrying the guns on the horse somewhere, and they will follow their steps. And it's really being successful. And also they often have, these NGOs often have their meetings where they exchange their techniques and how they are working. They share their knowledge and their experiences, and it's really being helpful to each other. They have their own communities where they discuss, they know each other. And Kyrgyzstan is very small, and it is really easy to get people whenever you need their support.
Thank you for expanding on that, Kenji. I'll take a few more questions. I think we have short time available. So Ian, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. Yes, very, very interesting presentations, and encouraging to hear those places where community participation is really working for conservation. The two things that worry me a little bit is when traditional values and uses of wildlife are incompatible with conservation and are actually illegal under the government's rules, but continue because of that tradition. It's a delicate one, but also where so many indigenous people and local communities don't have legal rights to the land, then whatever resources or revenues come, and this is particularly important with natural capital, the growing interest in payment for ecosystem services, the people who live there don't actually have a piece of paper proving that they own the land. They've just lived there for generations. How we can bring those into a legally binding system when their culture is outside that system.
Thank you for that question. I don't know if Dilys, you'd like to take this. You were speaking to this a little bit as part of some of the guiding principles.
Yeah, I can respond really briefly on it. Yeah, no, I agree with you, Ian. I think there are some cases where some uses have got to a scale that they're not necessarily compatible with conservation, and so there's bound to be trade-offs along the way. But I do inherently think that if rights are strong enough and community institutions are strong enough to set sort of regulatory boundaries, then that is generally consistent with conservation, because obviously there's a vested interest in maintaining resources in order to be able to continue to use them in the future. Those things generally get undermined when community institutions start to break down, traditional values start to break down, or you have an influx of outsiders into a community, and it's hard to actually define that community. And it kind of like goes back to Eleanor Ostrom's principles around common property resource management, about the need to have really clearly defined boundaries, etc. And then, yes, legal recognition and land titling is really, really critically important. I think it's something that is receiving increasing attention, but I do agree with you. I don't have the answer in front of me, but I do agree with you that we need better mechanisms to better recognise people that may not hold a piece of paper with legal title on, but, do have rights to that land and need to be able to benefit from that through some of these mechanisms that are being put in place. But I think there are many land rights groups that are working towards solutions on that kind of thing.
Thank you, Dilys, for that. Amy, did you want to come in as well, your perspective?
Yes, there we go. I just wanted to pick up on one aspect of Ian's question, and thanks, Ian, for that, which is bringing us back to CMS and also national law, which is, it's not that community-based management happens in a vacuum, of course. And we're looking at, first of all, species and only species that are not listed on our Appendix 1, which cannot be taken at all. We have very limited exceptions for that. And of course, national law often goes beyond that for species not listed on our treaty. But then within those species that can be taken, of course, there's still law and regulations that set some boundaries. So it's certainly not saying that community-based management is in itself always going to be the best solution for a particular species. So it's very dependent on the details. What species are we talking about? What is their status? What is the history of community engagement, and what structures we need to provide and resources to ensure that that the management taken is successful. So it's certainly not simple, and I don't think we can boil it down to generalized approaches. And therefore, coming back to the reports, that's why having these reports very much focused on the specific species in specific areas are so important, and to really look at that case by case.
Thank you, Amy, for that. We are at 1 p.m, but I know there's still quite a few questions, so I'll ask one more. Marianne, would you like to unmute yourself and pose your question? Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes,
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry for that. I have a very specific question. Thank you for the speakers for these really excellent presentations. It's really, really interesting. I'm the European Program Director for Resource Africa, doing CBNIM in Southern Africa. And I wanted to ask you, do you have in these initiatives any advocacy work to increase the financial and legal support and also awareness at the national, international level for these very, very good initiatives, so that it can be expanded in the region and beyond? Thank you.
Thank you. So did you direct your question to a specific speaker, or was it open?
No.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone like to respond to this one? Stefan, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe briefly. So in the report on Central Asia, we have made recommendations for expanding the use of community-based wildlife management in Central Asia, as so far there are only a few examples existing. And with this report, so with the launch today, we hope to promote the approach throughout the region and to make people and governments aware about this approach and the advantages it can have if the conditions are right. So yeah, after this launch, we hope to get more of these examples which have been presented today, especially from Kyrgyzstan, from Kenya.
Thank you. Wonderful. And I think final question, James, would you like to come in and ask your question?
Thank you very much indeed, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants. And thank you very much indeed to our speakers for some very interesting presentations. I should introduce myself, James Williams. I'm the CMS Scientific Counsellor from the United Kingdom, working at the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and it was work that colleagues worked with me, and I'd particularly like to thank Jess Turner for producing the principles that Dilys so ably introduced. It's a question, I think, maybe if it's more generally, but maybe Amy wants to pick this up, or possibly Dilys. Given the global reach of CMS, and we're talking here, of course, about aquatic, terrestrial, and avian species, I think there is a really important point about application of the principles by many parties and many individuals, and I would be keen to encourage use of those principles in the work that people are doing, and to hear any views from Kenji or Stefan about whether those principles are helpful in the real world to be able to make sure that we can take forward this conservation by communities and livelihoods in an effective manner. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for your question. Amy or Dilys, would you like to answer in the first instance? Oh, just a second while we unmute.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you, James. No, I think it's also a good point to, it kind of gets to what I said earlier, which is, first, I think it's very helpful that we have these principles, that there's 10 principles, but it really does come down to detailed specific cases. And I think it certainly would be helpful if there are the resources to do this, to get more feedback on their use. Certainly, I was thinking about maybe we would get a question on next steps. So I'll take your question as an opportunity for that, which is first and foremost, by launching these today, we certainly hope to reach, and through this webinar, to really disseminate this work and to get more people thinking about this. this topic will certainly continue to be a very important topic for CMS. It's been, I think, rising in discussions within CMS, which is a very good thing. And I look forward to continuing those discussions at our next COP, for example. And again, we have lots of mandates on all kinds of aspects of the species that we work on. And I do think that bringing these kinds of practices to bear, maybe in places that they have not been historically, but really have a likely role to play, is something that we should start to also look at. Can we identify some gaps, for example, and some challenges? I might just add a final pitch, which is our next COP, which will be in March. We're aiming at March 26, will be held in Brazil. And there's certainly a very deep tradition in Brazil across many different kinds of communities on management of natural resources. So I'm sure that this issue will be quite relevant to our COP that will be coming up. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy, for your response. And I don't know if we wanted to, Stefan, Kenji, add any kind of perspective from how these principles can be applied in the context of Central Asia. I think that was what James was asking as well. Would you like to come in? Okay.
Yeah. So I think these principles, I think, are, as I already given some examples from the perspectives of Kyrgyzstan, community-based wildlife management is really workable, achievable. As you see that in our cases, the uniqueness of these NGOs are that these NGOs are made from the local people, not the authority or the government made them. You know, that is by the initiative of the locals. Even the ex-poachers or hunters, let's say, they are, after they're giving some meetings, or after their, mind changed, and then they initiated to create such kind of NGOs. And I think also the local knowledge is, something like hunters never hunts for hunting. It is also used among the hunters, and they never hunted for snow leopards, such kind of things. The locals they have their own beliefs, and it is, their collective things here still exist in the country, and the community can control themselves easily. Even the government laws cannot work well in the communities. They have their own not written laws or regulations in the areas. And this is why, if we work closely to the communities and organize and manage the wildlife in the way that which is useful for them, and follow the example of these already existing NGOs, the others are, when I mentioned about the 10 NGOs, they are following each other's examples, and Kyrgyz people believe when they see with their own eyes, and this is why the Soshmkartur or other the Chongalai or Alai regions community-based conservancy NGOs, and when they saw their real good results, and they started to create their own. And also we use a lot social media to spread the information. Even journalists became very interested in the work. When within the framework of UNEP, we had the journalists, webinars or seminars for journalists, and we involved journalists to talk more about the ecological problems, issues, and to talk about this community-based conservancy, these NGOs, and this is how they got the information, and they saw it, and they believed that it is realistic when your neighboring communities implementing the same techniques or principles, and that is workable also in our areas. And thus all these CBCs spread all around the country, and the ILBIRS always support such kind of NGOs, and we work closely, and we have ears and hands everywhere in the country. And whenever we implement any types of projects or initiatives, we rely on them, and we have really trusted NGOs, people, communities, and from time to time, even when we started the survey in the new areas, they don't trust us. Yeah, they have some hesitation, or they look like us that we can steal their resources, something like that. But when you contact them, when you earn their trust, later on they open up and really they are open to collaborate with you. And the situation in not only in Kyrgyzstan, I mean for Central Asia is better now. The people are hunting or poaching, not for their food or not because of the low economic things. They have enough livestock for meat. They have like thousands of horses, but people can be greedy, or it can be like a hobby for them, and they can poach for them. And this is why, like, just keep working on the raising awareness of the communities and supporting such kind of NGOs and these principles. And I think it is achievable. And we really support this idea and the initiatives, and we are for this spreading this around the country, even for Central Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenji. It's really great to hear how you're already doing so much to implement some of these principles in practice, and how enthusiastic you are to do more. And I'm aware that we're overrunning a little bit, but I just wanted to thank you all for this really insightful discussion. Firstly, to all our presenters, but also all of you who have joined us today as well, to learn more about how we can encourage community participation in the conservation of migratory species. I wanted to note that both of the reports we were launching today are now available on the CMS website, where you can find them, download them, and share with anyone else who might be interested in your networks. I hope that you found this interesting, informative, and also useful for any work that you do in your respective organizations, places of work, countries. So thank you so much to everyone, and see you again soon. Thank you.